The new absolutist monarchs of Europe needed money to sustain their grand lifestyle, their patronage of art and architecture, and above all, to finance prolonged wars they often engaged in.
An aspect of the Renaissance princes was this, that they were desperate for money. They were desperate for money because they had to finance warfare, they had to pay the armies, and though you may argue that the strength of the armed forces was nothing in comparison to the armies maintained by the various sovereign states today, but they were big enough in the context of the time, and it required a lot of finances.
War cuts off old connections in trade and finance and requires the fashioning of new ones.
I will just give one quotation. Louis XII was preparing to invade the Duchy of Milan in 1499, and he asked one of his Italian commanders what was necessary for success. And the reply that he got was money, more money, and again more money. Money was this important. To military expenditure, we can add the costs of diplomacy. For example, the sums paid by the French between 1525 to 1546 to secure the friendship of the Swiss, the German Protestant princes, and Henry VIII of England, the salaries of royal officers, the pensions given to nobles. This was a financial aspect of that process in which the feudal nobility was being transformed into an aristocracy. When they were being paid pension, it implied that the feudal nobility no longer could rely on their land. After some times, these officers would retire and the state would pay them retirement benefits. Though this needed money, it also meant that the nobility was now being transformed or was already transformed into the bureaucracy. This household expenditures of the royal families, that also was involved a lot of money. They had these elaborate lifestyles, spent exorbitant sums of money because they had to maintain that grand appearance of theirs. So that also needed a lot of money. And of course, in buildings, in the patronage given to artistic works, all this required money, all this required finances. And what were the sources of finances? The first was, of course, the royal domain. But at the time we come to the 16th century, the importance of the royal domain as a source of revenue was diminishing. The second and the most important of the sources of royal finances was, of course, indirect taxes. By indirect taxes, we mean the customs duty and the sales tax. The problem that each Renaissance ruler faced was universal and critical disequilibrium between his income and his expenditure. The only possible solution to this problem was the system of direct taxation. But to collect taxes regularly, a monarch had to overcome a deep-seated aversion of his subjects and abrogate one of their most cherished and firmly entrenched beliefs, that the king should live on his own. That is, the revenue from the royal domain, from the indirect taxes were enough or should have been enough for the king to look after the administration of his kingdom, as well as to finance warfare. Taxation was recognized as an integral and necessary part of the government finance as far as all direct taxation was extraordinary. Ordinarily, none of the subjects recognized direct taxation. And no taxation could be imposed, very important, without the consent of the subject. Everywhere in Europe, the subjects consented to taxation through their representative bodies, whether it was the Estates General in Germany or the English Parliament or the Castilian or the Aragonese Cortes. And taxation was a periodic negotiation between a king demanding money and representatives of the clergy, the nobility and the commons in the realm, that is in the realm of the king, who were very reluctant to grant it. So the king would always demand money and the representatives of the people would reluctantly grant the king this demand or grant to the king this demand. And this dialogue between them was a complex struggle for power in which military necessity, financial need and the defense of property all played major roles, ultimately to determine the location of the sovereignty of the state. Whoever was more powerful would get what he desired.
In France, on the 2nd of December 1355, the clergy, the nobility and the deputies from the town assembled at Paris to consult a subvention which should suffice for the expenses of the war. They pledged to the king that they would give him 30,000 men at war every year. For their pay, they voted for an imposition of 1,000 lire, which was to be levied on all folks, church folks, nobles or others. They also proposed a gabel or salt tax over the whole kingdom of France.
People of France would have to buy salt from the royal warehouses at a stipulated price, and the French government made enormous profits out of this.
The salt tax and sales duty met with stiff opposition. Eventually, these were substituted by an income tax imposed on several layers of population, nobles or burghers, ecclesiastical or lay. The king's ordinance declared, "There shall be in each city 3 deputies, 1 for each estate. These deputies shall appoint in each parish collectorate, who shall go into the houses to receive declaration on assets from the dwellers. If anyone refused to take the oaths demanded, the collectors assessed his property according to general opinion and on the deposition of his neighbors."
And in Spain, there was the alcabala. The alcabala was a tax levied by the Spanish royal household of a 10% on the amount of commercial taxations. And it has been said that this tax was one of the contributing factors which led to the decline of vigor of the Spanish economic life in the 16th century, because the Spanish merchants had to pay 10% of all the commercial taxations to the state.
The members of the clergy and many towns were exempted from the tax. Nobles sometimes collected the tax for themselves instead of passing it on to the crown.
And the third important source of finances was borrowing. The kings, the monarchs would take loans. Some loans were forced, where agencies were forced to give money to the royal households. The bourgeoisie of the larger cities were the most frequent victims. They were forced by extra legal instruments to give loans to the ruler. The case of Toulouse in France is typical. Louis XII asked the citizens for a gift of 10,000 livres. So, you have to pay. This is decreed by the royalty or the monarch.
Charles VII, King of France from 1422 to 1461, succeeded partly with the aid of Joan of Arc in driving the English from the French soil and in solidifying the administration of the monarchy. Charles remodeled French finances, established heavy taxation, particularly through the taille, a direct land tax.
It was an achievement of Charles VII to extract from the Estates General the recognition of the continuing need of the crown for a reliable income. So it was during Charles VII's time that we find he could extract from the Estates General that consent that direct taxation was necessary for what? As a reliable income for the crown.
Taxation was not the only means of financing the wars.
And the other agency from which the monarchs borrowed were the merchants. The great merchants, the merchant bankers, and we find that specifically when the French were when the French undertook an expedition against Naples, we find that the Italian bankers helped the French monarch.
In 1548, the Florentines proposed the establishment of 4 banks in Lyon, Toulouse, Paris, and Rouen that would collect deposits on which interests would be paid at 8% per annum. The king would have priority of access to these funds, but in the absence of royal needs, they would be reloaned at a rate of 15% per annum to other borrowers. The most significant Florentine innovation was the Gros Parti of 1555. It was a bold attempt to place royal finances on a sustainable basis by consolidating short-term debts into tradable long-term security.
Now, a time came when royal credit sort of reached such an abyss, reached such a low that no merchant bankers were willing to give a loan to these royal households. Then how did these royal households or how did the monarch raise money?
By the end of 1557, a total of 9.66 million lire had been issued. But this too collapsed under the pressure of royal borrowing for the war.
They initiated 2 of the most interesting novelties of the 16th century government finance. One was the sale of government bonds and the floating of public loans. The Spanish government sold juros, annuities priced at 10 to 15 times their annual yield. So these juros would be sold and 10 to 15 times of the annual yields would ultimately be returned to the people. So they would use the money in the meantime to meet their expenses. In 1522, the French issued bonds which were called Rennes sur la Hotel de Ville, bearing 12% interest paid by the king and secured by the domains and the revenues of the city of Paris. The most spectacular credit operation of the period was the loan floated in 1555 by the Lyon banker Henry II. Now, what happened was this was one of the loans floated where people from all over Europe vied with one another to, buy or to, make or rather get the excessive profit that was promised by Henry II. But what happened was the speculative bubble burst during the great financial crisis of 1557.
The financial crisis of 1557 resulted from the Spanish and French kings' repudiation of debts after extensive and prolonged warfare.
And we find that both the French and the Spanish governments suspended payments and obligations, and people were lucky if they could, get back 30% of the amount that they invested. So we find that in the normal course, the absolutist monarchs could take recourse to three options as far as getting finances for their activities was concerned. One is the royal domain, the second is indirect taxes, and the third is loans or borrowing from various agencies.
geographical discovery পর থেকে আমেরিকা থেকে যে সোনা রূপাগুলো আসতো সেগুলো কোনো সম্পদের উৎস ছিল না।
Who brought the bullion? It's important. Did the government bring the bullion in its capacity, or was it someone else? Who reaped the benefits of the bullion import from America?
When Philip II took over the government of Netherlands in 1555 and of Castile in 1556, the Castilian revenue was 3 million ducats and the debts were no less than 20 million ducats. The situation in Netherlands was no better. King Philip made the decision to suspend payments on all his short-term debts. The market duly collapsed. The crash of 1557 to 1559, the first general financial market collapse in European history, did not mark the end of Franco-Spanish rivalry. It did, however, represent a major setback for their scheme of raising public money to finance wars. The next 100 years of struggle were to be financed by other means.
We find that in England, the situation is very different. Because England is a little different. It is across the channel. It is different in a way from the way the states in the continent functioned. For example, we find that in England, there were very few hired mercenaries, where we had discussed that the nobility of their own volition gave service to the king. So they were not paid for this. They came from affluent sections of the society. They were not paid for it, and therefore they had a certain kind of independence. But that's not the issue. The issue is the money that is needed to pay for the mercenary army was not required by England. In England, furthermore, everyone paid taxes, nobles as well as commons. In France, we find that it is actually the third estate. The nobility and the church is exempted from paying any taxes. The church sometimes has to pay taxes, but the nobility does not have to pay taxes. Sometimes what it does is it buys or it makes a lump sum payment to the ruler at one time so that it does not have to pay any future direct taxes. It is also the third estate who buys these privileges. But in England, this is not the case. Everyone is taxed in England. There is no differentiation as to who would pay the tax and who wouldn't pay the tax.
Ma'am, these direct taxes were levied on, means on what basis? They were taxed on what basis, ma'am?
There was always, if you say what percentage of the revenues the people would have to pay to the state, then this is fixed by the king. He decides how much is a particular person has to pay. What the amount of the taille is going to be is decided by the ruler, and of course in collusion with the Estates General if it's France. So that is something, even if you look at Indian history, this is, it doesn't remain constant. It changes from ruler to ruler. In England, we find the commons as well as the nobles, everyone had to pay taxes. The universal bite of taxation, along with the widespread experience in local government, encouraged in many a sense of political commitment and ambition to influence legislation and policy. English kings, they thus had no overwhelming military motive to tax regularly without consent, because people wanted to serve the king. So, military motive was not there, as there was a military motive either in Spain or in France. The richest and the most powerful in England were liable to taxation. And that is why these people, there was no disparity as the disparity in France. Everyone was willing to give taxes. And because the parliament was important in England, people wanted to become members of parliament. Initially, of course, they did not have the right to vote on issues. But even if the king did not abide by their various proposals, at least they initiated these processes. Sometimes we see that certain issues were raised by the members of parliament in their private capacity, especially in the House of Commons. You know that the English parliament is a bicameral parliament. And the parliament during Henry VIII and Elizabeth I was more or less an adjunct to the royal authority. But we find that by the time you go into the 17th century, it acts as a check on the government. The English parliament evolves into a much more important representative body of the people in comparison to the representative bodies elsewhere in Europe. Now, for example, we find that the difference between the governments in Spain and England needs to be analyzed, needs to be, viewed. We find that once we leave the 16th century and come to the 17th century, in England, we have what is called a limited monarchy, limited by the parliament. And France moved towards absolutism. So, this is the difference, or absolutism in different countries evolved into different kinds of absolutism, different kinds of monarchies. When we are talking about new monarchy, we are not talking about new monarchy where developments are uniform. They vary from place to place. Of course, basic characteristics are the same. But this does not mean to say that in England, the king did not have much power. One phrase which was used by the Archbishop of Canterbury is very important. He uses the phrase, ira principis mors est, which means the anger of the prince is death. So even in England, no one would actually challenge the authority of the king, because the anger of the prince or the king is death. But unlike the Frenchmen, we find that royal authority in England rested on the active cooperation of the king's subjects. Therefore, we can conclude that like other 16th century institutions, Renaissance monarchy was a transitional form. It was an intermediary state, a complex amalgam of tradition and innovation. Why tradition? Because feudal elements were very perceptible in these new monarchies. By 1560, in the key monarchies of Western Europe, giant steps had been taken towards what? Territorial unification, administrative centralization. In feudalism, we spoke about administrative decentralization and magnification of royal power. The king's power would be lionized. He was so very important, the omnipresence and the omniscience of the ruler. The rapid accumulation of the exclusive prerogatives by the central governments of France, Spain and England to make laws, to govern through legal, financial and administrative officers, to tax, to declare war and to make peace, to exercise ultimate jurisdiction and to mint money, defines their transformation from feudal monarchies into sovereign territorial states.